Now that we've set everything up so that we can animate it and easily adjust the colors, we can actually move on to building the neon look. So first of all, I want to pre-compose all of these layers so that it's all contained into a single layer. So I'll select everything by pressing Command A or Control A on a PC, and then pre-compose by pressing Command Shift C or Control Shift C on a PC, and rename this Neon Source. Everything else is fine. I'll press OK, and now we have all of that artwork contained on a single layer, and if I double click on that, we're right back where we were. So I still have control of every layer. And while we're in here, I'm going to go ahead and turn off some of the duplicate overlapping layers. Since this isn't actually how I'll ever see my sign, I want to make sure that I design the neon glow on top of something that it actually would represent. So I can actually turn off both copies of this burger and that spatula, and one of the two flames, and I'll build my glow off of that. Now if I come back into this composition, first thing I want to do is make a background, because right now the glow would be blending on top of the black, and I want to know what it's going to look like blending on top of the actual background color. So I'll double click the rectangle tool, which will make a rectangle the size of my composition, and I'll move it to the back and rename it background. Then I'll change the fill type to gradient, press OK, and then click on the color to adjust the gradient, and change the first color to a dark blue, the second color to a slightly lighter blue, and I actually want these to be in the opposite order, so I'll just reverse the two positions, make this a little bit more blue, press OK, and then click and drag on this little handle to adjust the size of my gradient. Now that's brighter than I want it to be, so I'm going to go back in and adjust these colors a little bit more. And that probably will work just fine. I'll zoom in a little bit so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. And then I'm just going to lock this background so I can't accidentally move it around. Next, we need to change our color depth from 8 bits per channel to 32 bits per channel. So I'll hold down Option or Alt on a PC and click twice. And now we can start building the glow. So I'll start by selecting my source layer and duplicating it by pressing Command D or Control D on a PC. Then I want to change the blending mode. And if you don't see this column right here, make sure you have this second button down here expanded so that your transfer controls are visible. And I'll change this from normal down to add. And right away you can see that makes everything a little bit brighter. It almost looks a little glowy, but it doesn't look very nice. So I want to add a fast blur effect to this duplicate layer. And you'll notice that this effect works with 32-bit color. Now if I increase the blurriness, it adds a glow to my artwork. If my mode was set to normal, it still looks somewhat like a glow, but there's no real blending happening. Setting this blending mode to add makes everything underneath this layer brighter, so it generates a more realistic glow. I'm going to rename this layer Glow 1. Then I'm going to duplicate it again. You see now everything's getting much brighter, and I'm going to increase the blurriness so we get a little bit softer glow. Then I'll do this one more time, and you'll notice that this automatically increments the name for me, and then I'll make this top glow even bigger. Now, this is a little too glowy, everything's a little bit too soft, and it doesn't look very natural. So what I want to do is lower the opacity of each one of these layers. So with all three of them selected, I'll press T on the keyboard to bring up the opacity, and then I'll adjust the opacity of the top layer first, so that it's just a faint glow, and then I'll adjust the opacity of the second layer, and then finally the first layer. So that just knocks the intensity back a little bit. And that's what we started with, and that's what the 3 layers of glow add. Right now this doesn't look very bright to me, but we can enhance this look by adding another effect onto our blur layers. So I'll come over to my effects and presets and type in exposure. And under color correction, you'll see the 32-bit supported exposure effect. Then I'm going to apply it to the first glow and shut off the other 2 glows just for now. Then I want to bring the exposure above the fast blur in the effects stack and take a look at these controls. The exposure effect allows me to increase the exposure value for that layer as well as the gamma. And because we're working in 32 bits per channel, we're actually adjusting the luminance value for that layer instead of just a brightness value. So if I click and drag this exposure up, you can see that it's not only getting brighter, but that the colors are also getting a little bit more washed out. If I turn the gamma up a little bit as well, you can really tell that it's starting to turn white. I'll reset this, increase the exposure a little bit, turn the gamma down a little bit, until it's looking about the way that I want it. I'm going to turn the blur down just a little bit, maybe decrease the opacity, and then increase the exposure a little bit more. Building this effect is completely to your own taste. There's a lot of back and forth with playing with these different settings. What I really enjoy about the process is that I get to design exactly how this glow looks. So my glow might look a little bit different from what yours ends up looking like. Now I can tell this is still a little bit too bright, so I'm going to turn the opacity down right about there. Then I'll turn on the glow for the second layer. And I'm going to copy the exposure and paste it onto the glow. Again, I'll bring it up above the fast blur, turn the exposure down a little bit, set the gamma back down to 1, and then maybe turn the opacity down just a little bit. And you know, that blur might be a little bit too big as well, so I'm going to adjust that. And everything is still looking a little bit too soft to me. I think the reason why is because my lines might be a little too thick. So I'm going to go back into any one of these pre-comps, select all of my artwork, and then change the stroke value from 2 to 1. So now all of my lines just decreased half in thickness. If I go back out, now that glow is much less intense. And I think a stroke width of 1 is going to work much better for this design. Now I'll turn on my third glow, and it's very subtle. If I turn this opacity back up to 100%, you can see what it's doing. It's a very blurred out version of the artwork, so it's producing a very soft glow. I like the way that looks, but I think I'm going to try and make it a little bit brighter. So again, I'll copy the exposure and paste it onto this layer. Now that is way too much, so I'm going to reset it, increase the exposure, and then maybe turn down the gamma a little bit. I think that's a little bit better, but now I'm going to turn down the opacity just a bit. That's pretty cool. So far so good. Now just looking at this, I don't think it's appearing to be bright enough yet. Looking at neon signs on Google, you'll notice that there are lots of different looking neon lights. So it really is up to you how you want your design to look. Personally, I want the inside of my lines to be brighter. To do that, I'm going to duplicate my source layer one more time and solo it, and then I'm going to add a fill effect to this layer. You'll see that that's 32-bit compatible. Double click on the effect and then change the color to pure white. And I don't need to increase this value past pure white. It's fine just the way it is. I'll hit OK, rename this layer Core, and then unsolo it. Then I'll set it to add, and I feel like that makes everything look a little bit brighter. But because it's the same size as my original artwork, it's covering up the entire thing. And I only want it to appear on the inside of that line. So I'm going to add another effect called Simple Choker. And what this will do, if I solo this layer again, is allow me to increase or decrease the size of the layer based on the alpha channel. So if I just increase this a little bit, you'll see that my lines get a little bit thinner, keeping in mind that this is a pre-comp of my original artwork. So the 1 pixel stroke value hasn't changed. This is just an effect applied on top of that pre-comp. Then I can unsolo and see how that affects my overall look. I think I could increase this choke just a little bit more. I really want this layer to be subtle. That looks pretty good. What I might do is come to my first glow and turn the blurriness down just a little bit more, so it's much closer to the actual bulb. If I back out a little bit, I think that's looking pretty nice. The whole thing might be a little bit too bright, so I'm just going to turn down the opacity of that core just to be about, let's say, 50%. And I think that layer just gives it a little bit of a pop to sell this neon bulb look. Now if I duplicate my glow one more time, move it to the top, and reset the blur, I'm going to change the blur dimensions from horizontal and vertical to just horizontal. Now if I turn my opacity all the way back up and increase the blurriness, you'll notice that this blur is now being produced just horizontally, and it produces a really cool looking blur. If I were to change this to vertical, then it would just go up and down. Because everything is being based on a pre-comp, you can apply any number of effects to adjust the look of this glow, and as long as it's set to add, it will blend on top and do some really cool things because we're blending this all in 32 bits per channel. I could increase the exposure to make everything brighter, maybe adjust the gamma a little bit, and then turn the opacity down. And I'm going to set this back to horizontal, and right now I think these lines are a little bit too crisp, so I'm actually going to duplicate this layer, come back to the first one, hit reset so it goes back to horizontal and vertical, and then blur the layer just a little bit so that this layer gets softened a little bit before it gets blurred out horizontally. And that way this layer's glow is just a little bit softer. And I'm not having enough control just by clicking and sliding this value. So a nice trick when adjusting a slider value is if you hold down Command while clicking and dragging, it'll decrease the speed that you're changing the value by. So I want to put this to right around 1.7, and I'm pretty happy with that. But this is a little too intense of a glow, and I don't think turning down the opacity is going to do enough. So I'm going to add another effect, which is curves. And instead of RGB, I'm going to switch this to alpha. So now we're working on the alpha channel. If I click and drag this, you see it gets brighter. If I click and drag this, it'll get darker. So what I want to do is just adjust this curve so that the brighter values are a little bit more visible and that the darker values fade off much quicker. So that's before and after. And that way this effect is just a little bit more subtle. Now again, I think this is a little too intense, so I'm going to turn that down a little bit and maybe increase the blurriness prior to the horizontal blur. Then I'll bring back a little bit of that glow on the lower end, but not too much. I think that looks pretty good. I'll rename this layer Glow Horizontal. Then I'll duplicate that layer and rename it Glow Vertical. And I'll change this second fast blur from horizontal to vertical. And this one I want to make much less noticeable, so I'll turn down the opacity and increase this curves on the alpha channel a little bit. But then I might turn up the exposure, maybe increase the opacity just a little bit more, and then turn down the amount on that vertical blur. Now, as you can see, everything is getting super bright, and that's because I keep stacking more and more layers on top of each other. So you just have to keep adjusting things as you go. I think I could turn down this Glow 3 just a little bit. Maybe Glow 2 is a little too intense as well. And Glow 1, that's probably fine. The core is doing okay. Now what if I wanted to make a glow that wasn't just straight left and right or up and down? Well, let's duplicate this Glow Vertical again, and I'll get rid of the fast blurs and the curves. Then I'm going to add an effect called Directional Blur, which is also supported by 32-bit. If I increase this blur, you can see that it's doing a similar type of blur to our fast blur, but it gives me a direction control. So I could change this to something like 55, and now our blur is going at an angle. So I'll rename this layer Glow Diagonal, turn down the opacity, increase the exposure a little bit, turn down the gamma, and then add a curves layer. And again, we'll switch it to the alpha channel and just knock the intensity of this glow down quite a bit. Again, I think it's a little bit harsh, so I'm going to add a fast blur, and I'm going to put it before the directional blur so that everything gets a little bit softer before that directional blur is applied. But not too much, because I want this one to look a little bit more chiseled. I think that's good. Maybe adjust the opacity just a little bit, and I'm liking the way that that looks. Now I want to add one more horizontal blur, so I'll duplicate that layer, move it to the top. I'm going to rename this Glow Wide. And this time I'm going to take the first blur and increase the value a lot more. I'll reset the curves layer and adjust that in a minute. Then I'll turn the opacity up, just so I can see a good representation of what this layer is doing. Then I'm going to change the value of the horizontal blur to be much more intense, so it's super wide, going all the way to the edge of my composition. Then I'm going to turn the gamma correction down just a little bit, and maybe turn the exposure up. Now I'll lower the opacity, and switch to alpha on my curves layer, and decrease the intensity on that a little bit as well. Now we've got this super wide glow that makes the entire sign look a little bit more vibrant. And I just noticed that I have a layer turned on inside of my pre-comp that I shouldn't, so I'm going to go back into that pre-comp, find that layer, and turn it off. I go back into my pre-comp, and we'll update, and that's looking pretty cool. From here, you just make adjustments as you see fit. You can use any number of effects to build your own custom glow, and then make adjustments to those glows until you've built something completely custom. But just as a reminder, this is where we started, and this is where we ended up. And the entire effect is based on that single pre-comp. So anything we do to change our artwork will be automatically updated with our glow. Now if we take a look at some neon signs on Google, you can see that obviously my design is heavily stylized. My lines are very thin, these glows are not very realistic, but that's the look I was going for. Like this one, for example, has a bulb that's much thicker than mine. So if I wanted to replicate this look, I'd need to go back into my pre-comp and then change the thickness of the stroke of all of my artwork. So I'd select all of my art, and then increase the stroke a bit. Now you can already tell I did not create this design to work with a line this thick, but I want to show you what happens to my glow if I actually increase the stroke this much. It completely blows out. And that's because the glow that I designed was based on a 1 pixel width stroke, and I increased the stroke to 4. So the lines are 4 times as thick, which means there's 4 times as much content emitting light in this comp. So that's why you want to make sure that you know exactly how thick you want your lines to be before you build your glow. Because if I really wanted it to be this thick, I'm going to have to go back through and adjust all the opacities and intensities of all the effects that we already spent the time tailoring specifically to a 1 pixel width stroke.